Apocalyptic Ingenuity is already mediocre on its own, but the pallet density update stopped this perk from ever becoming useful in the first place. Pallets are without a doubt the most valuable resource in Dead by Daylight. Unless the killer is a nurse, a pallet will almost certainly be used at least once in a standard chase. And because pallets are so valuable, one would think that allowing survivors the ability to rebuild pallets would be an insanely strong ability. For the longest time though, I wondered if DBD could ever reach a point in which rebuilding pallets would be a possibility. Pallets have been all over the place in terms of their strength and amounts. Back in the early days of this game, most maps were overflowing with pallets. Blood Lodge is one of the best examples of this, as that map was genuinely unplayable for any basic M1 killer. And now here we are sitting at the cusp of DBD's 10th year anniversary, and things like the pallet density update have added new complications to the pallet balance on many realms. However, as quick as I heard about this perk is as quick that I realized this perk would be essentially worthless. This perk only allows survivors the ability to rebuild fragile pallets, and only under certain conditions. First, a survivor must search or rummage a chest twice to activate the perk. Then, once the perk is activated, it can only be used to rebuild pallets that were already broken. Not to mention the speed to rebuild the pallet is already on the slower side, but that's beside the point. Having the perk be restricted to fragile pallets or having there be restrictions on where the pallets can be built is fine for balancing purposes, but having both of these restrictions is where the perk becomes very bad. It's made much worse when this perk was not even the first time that pallets could be rebuilt. Apocalyptic Ingenuity was released in the summer of 2025, which was well after survivors had already been given the ability to rebuild pallets. In previous years, the anniversary events gifted survivors the ability to spawn fragile pallets, and these anniversary pallets were a much better version of Apocalyptic Ingenuity pallets. Not only was the creation of an anniversary pallet pretty much instant, a survivor could also create an anniversary pallet wherever there was an open spot for a pallet to spawn. A great visual representation of what I'm referring to here would be the main boat on Pale Rose. Anniversary pallets could be put almost anywhere, but Apocalyptic Ingenuity would be heavily restricted in this case. Now yes, the anniversary pallets were part of an event, so maybe they deserved more special treatment, but how about the Scout class in 2v8 for example? The first version of 2v8 launched in the summer of 2024, and the Scout class creates sturdy pallets from previously broken ones. And yes, 2v8 is a much different environment due to there being 2 killers running around instead of just 1. And yes, the Scout class is limited to rebuilding pallets once every minute or so. However, there's no reason why Apocalyptic Ingenuity is so heavily restricted in both the placement and the sturdiness of the pallets. In my view, there should be heavy restrictions with one or the other, not both. But even beyond the built-in weaknesses of the perk itself, Apocalyptic Ingenuity will simply never be useful thanks to the recent pallet density updates. With more pallets on every map, there becomes even less of a reason to use a perk to create fragile pallets. Most matches end up having at least a few sturdy pallets left over, so there's almost never a reason to waste a perk slot on a perk that can only rebuild fragile pallets. Exhaustion perks, anti-tunnel perks, healing perks, and generator perks are already way stronger than Apocalyptic Ingenuity as it stands today. One of the only builds that is somewhat valuable is the combination of Apocalyptic Ingenuity with Flip-Flop, Power Struggle, and Plot Twist. But even then, this perk still feels mediocre to use. Those other 3 perks can be used together on their own quite well thanks to the many sturdy pallets that already spawn. And fragile pallets are already weak enough on their own, so why go through the trouble of creating pallets that will serve almost no purpose? One somewhat useful feature about Apocalyptic Ingenuity is that it can function as an inverse version of Windows of Opportunity and 5 moves ahead. This is because the perk provides aura reading of any broken pallets within a 32-meter radius. So in a weird way, Apocalyptic Ingenuity can help tell you where not to go, with the only caveat being that the aura reading only works once the perk is fully activated. Altogether, the pallet density update technically had a positive impact to this perk, as it allowed for more places and opportunities to reconstruct pallets. However, if there are more sturdy pallets on the map than before, why not just run to those instead of a fragile pallet? The idea of reconstructing a pallet sounds very strong at first, even if it's only a fragile pallet, but in actuality this perk is pretty much worthless in a large majority of matches. This perk would arguably be more valuable to use if there were less sturdy pallets to use on a map. However, with less pallets on a map means that there's less places to reconstruct pallets. And all this is precisely why I find this perk to be overly restricted. It needs at least one less restriction before it can ever be considered a decent perk. The time investment to activate the perk is almost never worth it, and it's a perk that is heavily outclassed by other event mode abilities. And while Apocalyptic Ingenuity is still mediocre on its own, it will likely never become useful until the pallet density update is reworked once again. And in the event it's reworked, who knows how that will go. I'm curious to hear if Apocalyptic Ingenuity has ever been useful for anybody else, because I for one have had major problems trying to get it to be useful, so feel free to share in the comments if you have any build ideas or anything. But that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.